Move it. Where's your proof of financial hardship? Miles Grayson barked, jerking his chin toward Annie as though she were nothing more than an obstacle holding up the entire line. I have it, sir. I brought everything. Annie fumbled as she pulled the worn folder away from her chest. She had been clutching it since morning, so tightly that the cardboard cover had grown soft with sweat. My identification, the rent notice, my employment statement, and my grandmother's medical records, they're all in here. Miles did not look at the folder. He looked at Annie. His gaze traveled slowly from her hair, damp and matted after hours in the heat, down to her faded, wrinkled coat, then stopped at the sole of her left shoe, which had begun peeling away from the toe. The corner of his mouth curled with contempt. Dressed like that, and you still need paperwork to prove you're struggling? Annie froze. Miles leaned one hand against the table and raised his voice just enough for everyone behind her to hear. You came here asking for food assistance, looking like you slept all night in those clothes, and now you're putting on a show with a folder full of proof? Several people in line lowered their heads. Others quietly looked away. Annie did not answer immediately. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the folder. All morning, she had prepared herself to answer questions about her income, rent, electric bills, and the cost of her grandmother's medication. She had believed she could explain everything calmly, but she had not prepared herself to defend the only clean coat she owned. My name is on the list, she said softly. I registered last week. I've been standing here since this morning, and it's almost evening now. Miles glanced toward the line stretching nearly across the warehouse. Everyone behind you has been waiting too. Do you think you're the only one who's been standing all day? I never said I was special. Then stop acting as though your time matters more than everyone else's. Annie opened her mouth to explain, but Miles had already grabbed a thin grocery bag from beneath the table and tossed it down in front of her. A dented can of soup struck the tabletop, rolled once, and stopped beside a packet of instant noodles. Inside the bag were a loaf of white bread, a package of dried beans, a small jar of peanut butter, and several cans of food nearing their expiration dates. Miles pushed the bag toward her with the tips of 2 fingers. There, take it and go. Annie peered through the clear plastic. She hesitated for several seconds before gathering the courage to ask, Sir, do you have any oatmeal? Miles slowly lifted his head. What did you just say? Oatmeal? Annie repeated, rushing to explain. My grandmother has diabetes. She needs food that's low in sugar and sodium. The notice said there might be oatmeal or frozen vegetables today. Miles stared at her as though she had said something ridiculous. The notice said food would be provided. There's food sitting right in front of you. But my grandmother can't eat most of this. Then perhaps your grandmother should learn not to be so picky. Annie went still. Miles folded his arms across his chest and continued coldly. When someone else is paying for your meals, you shouldn't make too many demands. The words hurt Annie more than she had expected. She set the grocery bag down gently, afraid that if she moved too quickly, the cans of soup inside might spill onto the table. My grandmother isn't being picky, she said. She's sick. Miles suddenly slammed his palm against the table. Enough. The sound made Annie flinch. Hand over the paperwork, or take that bag and step aside. I don't have time to listen to your family problems. Annie hurriedly opened the folder. The rubber band wrapped around the cover had stretched loose after 2 MARTA bus rides and hours of standing in the heat. The papers inside had shifted out of order. She lowered her head and tried to separate her identification from the rent notice, but her fingers had grown stiff from clutching the folder for so long. I have it right here, she said, her breathing quickening. Please give me 1 second. Miles checked his watch and let out a contemptuous laugh. That's a very long second. Annie bit her lip and continued sorting through the papers. An elderly woman standing directly behind her rested both hands on a wooden cane and spoke gently. I can wait. It's all right. Miles looked over Annie's shoulder. Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. The girl has been here since early this morning, the woman said. I saw her when I arrived. Let her find her papers. A man farther back in line nodded. She even held my place when I needed to sit down. Give her another minute. Miles's expression immediately darkened. This line moves when I say it moves. No one asked either of you to run this distribution table. The woman with the cane raised her chin and looked him directly in the eye. No one asked you to humiliate people either. The area around the table suddenly fell silent. Several people turned to watch. Realizing that he had become the center of attention, Miles lowered his voice. But the cruelty in every word became even sharper. He pointed directly at Annie's folder. You expect to apply for assistance with that pile of garbage? Hand it over now. If you can't find the right documents, get out of the way and let the next person receive their share. Annie's hands began to tremble. She hated that Miles could see it. She hated the feeling of dozens of eyes fixed on her. A few people watched with sympathy. Others lowered their heads, perhaps because they had endured the same humiliation and did not want to become his next target. I have the correct documents, Annie said, struggling to keep her voice steady. I organized them carefully before I left home. Miles smirked. Then perhaps you should have known how to keep them organized. Annie pulled out her employment statement. At the same time, a yellowed legal agreement folded into quarters slipped out with it. No, that isn't the one. Losing patience, Miles snatched the entire stack from her hands. Annie's eyes widened in alarm. Please be careful. My grandmother's medical records are in there. Miles ignored her. He flipped through several pages, barely reading more than a few lines before frowning. What is this? I'm not sure. Miles looked up at her. You're not sure? An older man gave those papers to me last month. And you simply stuffed them into your folder and brought them here? I know my identification and rent notice are in there. The other papers were already inside the folder. Miles laughed and turned toward the employee beside him as though Annie had said the most ridiculous thing he had heard all day. Unbelievable. You bring old contracts, papers of unknown origin, and whatever other junk you found around your house, then expect us to sort through it for you? I didn't ask you to sort through anything. Annie reached toward the stack. I only need my rent notice back. Don't raise your voice at me. I'm not raising my voice. Miles clenched his jaw. People who come here asking for free handouts always have endless excuses. None of you bothers to prepare properly. But you expect us to stand here and serve you one at a time. Annie looked at him, her eyes reddening with humiliation. I did prepare, sir. I'm only asking you to return my papers. Miles shoved the stack toward her. Take this pile of trash and leave. Annie quickly reached out with both hands. At that exact moment, Miles used his elbow to push the folder aside. Its edge caught on the handle of the grocery bag, knocking her hands out of position. The folder slipped from Annie's grasp. It struck the concrete floor with a dry slap. Dozens of papers scattered in every direction. Annie's identification slid beneath the table. Her grandmother's medical records skidded toward the waiting line. The rent notice landed face down beside a plastic chair. The old legal agreement unfolded near a carton of canned goods. A thick sheet of cream-colored paper bearing a dark red metallic seal spun across the floor and came to rest several feet away. Annie immediately dropped to her knees. I'm sorry. I'll pick everything up. Miles watched her crawl beneath the table without the slightest trace of regret. You should apologize to everyone waiting behind you. Look at the mess you've made. Annie lowered her head even further. I didn't mean to. Of course you didn't. People like you never mean to do anything. The woman with the cane slowly bent down to pick up one of the papers, but Annie quickly raised a hand to stop her. Please don't bend down. Your leg is hurting. You held someone else's place this morning, the woman said. Now let someone help you. Before either of them could reach the sealed document, a pair of highly polished black shoes stopped beside it. Richard Caldwell was crossing the warehouse with two board members, a communications director, and a local reporter. The cameras had followed him from the fresh produce display to a row of beautifully packed food boxes arranged specifically for photographs. He noticed the paper at his feet, only because of the embossed red seal. Richard stopped. He bent down and picked it up. Annie quickly stood. She pressed the papers she had gathered against her wrinkled coat, loose strands of hair falling across her pale face. Excuse me, sir, she said. That belongs in my folder. Richard did not answer. His eyes had already settled on the words printed across the top. Caldwell Global. Directly beneath them were the words, Class S Strategic Share Ownership Certificate. Richard's expression changed. He raised the document toward the light and examined the registration number, the embossed corporate watermark, and the red metallic seal near the bottom of the page. Those security features could not have been produced by an ordinary printer. Richard had seen this kind of certificate inside his family's private vault. Only a handful had ever been issued worldwide. His eyes slowly moved toward the name printed in bold across the center of the document. Annie Brooks. Richard's pupils constricted. The certificate confirmed that Annie Brooks was the legal owner of 49% of Caldwell Global's strategic shares. These were not ordinary shares. They carried special voting rights, independent auditing authority, and the power to veto any decision that could alter control of the corporation. Richard immediately turned to the second page. The transfer had been officially recorded 3 weeks earlier. The signature of Harold Caldwell, Richard's father, appeared above the notarized seal. Beneath it was the name of Evelyn Shaw, the independent legal counsel who had worked with the Caldwell family for more than 20 years. This could not be a joke, and it could not be a forgery. Miles hurried around the table and stepped beside Richard. "Mr. Caldwell, there seems to be some misunderstanding." Richard continued staring at the document. Miles pointed toward Annie. She brought in a pile of highly questionable paperwork. "I was about to call security and have her removed before she disrupted the program." Annie bent down to retrieve another document, too frightened to look directly at anyone. Richard remained silent. Miles forced an uneasy laugh. "People bring all kinds of worthless papers in here. Old contracts, expired bills, things they picked up somewhere. That document probably isn't worth troubling yourself over." Richard slowly raised his head. The look in his eyes froze the smile on Miles's face. "This is not worthless paperwork." The reporter immediately stepped forward. Richard's communications director quickly moved in front of the camera, but even she could not conceal the shock on his face. Miles swallowed hard. "But she came here asking for food." Richard did not respond. Annie stood several feet away, clutching the remaining papers against her chest. She did not understand why everyone had suddenly fallen silent. A month earlier, a pawnshop owner had looked at the same documents for only a few seconds before throwing them back at her. "Waste paper," he had said. "I wouldn't give you a single dollar for this garbage." Annie had believed him. She had kept the papers only because the folder was still useful for carrying her identification, rent notice, and her grandmother's medical records. Richard looked at the faded coat hanging from her shoulders. He looked at the peeling sole of her shoe, her thin, trembling hands, and the cheap bag of groceries lying carelessly on the table. Then he looked down at the document in his hand once more. "Who is Annie Brooks?" His voice was not loud, yet the entire food distribution area immediately fell silent. Annie looked up. She hugged the remaining documents tightly against her chest, as though she feared someone might snatch them from her again. "Amsir." Richard's hand tightened around the certificate as cold sweat began to gather across his forehead. Miles's expression changed immediately. The contempt vanished from his face so quickly that it seemed never to have existed. In its place appeared a gentle, respectful, perfectly practiced smile, the kind he had clearly used countless times in front of powerful people. "Mr. Caldwell, there's no need for you to concern yourself with such a minor matter." Miles hurried around the table, moved closer to Richard, and lowered his voice as though he were protecting him from an inconvenience unworthy of his attention. "I'll take care of everything here. You've been standing all afternoon, and you must be exhausted. Please, go get some rest. I'll have security verify her information and clear up this misunderstanding." Richard did not look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the red-sealed certificate in his hand. "What misunderstanding?" Miles's smile faltered for a moment. "These documents may not be legitimate." Richard slowly raised his head. "Based on what?" Miles wet his dry lips, then glanced toward Annie. She came through a charity line carrying internal corporate documents that she admits she doesn't understand. That alone raises serious questions. Annie was still holding the papers she had gathered against her chest. Their stiff edges pressed painfully into her arms, but she did not dare loosen her grip, afraid they might fall again and be stepped on. "I never claimed those papers were worth anything," she said quietly. "You snatched them from my hands and knocked the folder onto the floor." Miles spun toward her. The smile he had worn for Richard disappeared at once. "I'm speaking to Mr. Caldwell." Annie's shoulders drew in slightly, but she struggled to keep her voice calm. "And I'm speaking about my papers." The woman with the cane stepped forward and stood close beside Annie, as though trying to shield her with her small frame. "The girl is telling the truth," she said. "You pushed the folder down. We all saw it." Miles glanced at the faces watching him. He maintained his strained smile, but his eyes darkened. "Ma'am, please return to your place in line." The woman with the cane did not move. "I'm already standing in my place." Richard did not join the argument. He turned back to the first page of the certificate, carefully examined the owner's name, and asked, "Annie, where did you get this?" Annie looked at the paper in his hand. To her, it was still nothing more than an unfamiliar document, even though everyone around her now stared at it as if it might change someone's fate. An older man gave me the folder last month. What man? I don't know his last name. Annie hesitated. He only told me his name was Harold. Richard's jaw tightened at once. His communications director leaned toward him and spoke in a low voice. We should move this conversation away from the reporters. But it was already too late. A local reporter standing nearby had raised her phone and aimed the camera directly at them. Mr. Caldwell, is that a company share certificate? No comment, the communications director replied immediately, stepping forward to partially block the camera's view. Richard turned to one of the security officers. Close the press area. Do not take anyone's phone or touch anyone's property. Just ask the camera crews to move to the front entrance. Miles nodded at once, moving quickly as though the order had been given directly to him. Of course, sir. I'll take the young woman into the back office while your team continues the event. No. That single word from Richard stopped Miles in his tracks. He blinked. Sir? You will not take her anywhere. I only thought we should question her privately to prevent any further disruption. Richard turned his head toward him. You called these documents trash without even reading them. I was only managing the line. You were humiliating her. Miles' smile stiffened. I admit my words may have sounded somewhat harsh, but we receive fraudulent applications every week. People hide income, bring altered notices, or use addresses that do not belong to them. I was simply doing my job and protecting the program. Annie looked at him. Her eyes were still red with humiliation, but her voice no longer trembled. You never even read my application. Miles answered coldly. I saw enough. Annie lowered her gaze to the faded coat on her body. Her hand unconsciously pulled the two sides closer together, as though only then had she realized that everyone was staring at its wrinkles. You only saw my coat. A quiet murmur of agreement came from the line. Then several more voices joined it. Miles moved closer to Richard and lowered his voice. Mr. Caldwell, this is turning into a spectacle. Let me remove the problem before it damages the event. Richard finally looked directly at him. The problem is not the line. Miles fell silent at once. Richard handed the certificate to a gray-haired board member standing beside him. Thomas, compare this registration number with the shareholder records. Thomas Reed accepted the document, held it closer to the light, and examined the seal. This is a Class S strategic share certificate. I can see that. If it's genuine, the transfer should be recorded in the company's shareholder ledger. Call legal immediately. The communications director moved closer again. Richard, the donors are still waiting on the other side of the warehouse. Let them wait. While the people in expensive suits spoke among themselves, Annie bent down again to collect the last few papers scattered near the legs of the table. None of the powerful people around her noticed that the knees of her worn pants were now coated in dust from the concrete floor, or that her hands were trembling so badly she had to try twice before she could pick up her grandmother's medical report. The woman with the cane slowly bent down and helped her gather the papers one by one. When Annie reached for her identification card near Miles' shoe, he finally moved his foot aside. He did not look at her, nor did he apologize for nearly stepping on the card bearing her name. If Annie's courage and quiet dignity touched your heart, please like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Then subscribe to the channel for more inspiring and heartwarming stories. The grocery bag remained open on the table. A dented can of soup had rolled out and stopped near Richard's hand. Annie picked it up, placed it back in the bag, and looked up at him. May I have my certificate back? Richard looked at her. Not yet. Annie's shoulders immediately stiffened. She clutched the folder more tightly, and a flicker of fear crossed her face. Only minutes earlier, Miles had snatched her papers from her hands. Now another man was holding something with her name on it and refusing to return it. It belongs to me. I need to verify it. You can verify it while I'm holding it. Richard frowned slightly. This concerns my company. Annie looked at him. Her voice was very soft, but every word was clear. It concerns my name. Her response made Richard pause. Annie held out one hand. Her fingertips were still trembling. Please give it back to me. Richard examined the legal seal once more. After several seconds of hesitation, he handed the certificate back to her. Annie accepted it with both hands, carefully placed it between two rent notices, and pressed the folder against her chest. She held it the way a poor person might protect the only possession they had left, even though she still did not understand how valuable it truly was. Miles stared at Richard in disbelief. You're actually giving it back to her? Richard turned toward him. It was never mine to give or keep in the first place. Thomas had just finished his phone call. He approached them with a grave expression, entirely different from Miles' false confidence. Legal is checking the shareholder ledger. Evelyn Shaw is here with the donor group. I asked her to come over. Richard looked toward the entrance. Why is Evelyn here? She was invited as a former legal advisor to the company. Miles cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Until the authenticity of the documents has been confirmed, security should at least inspect the folder. Annie immediately stepped back. The reaction was so quick that it was almost instinctive. She pressed the folder tightly against her body, her eyes widening when she noticed a security officer standing nearby. The woman beside her raised her cane slightly. She did not use it as a weapon, but her posture made one thing clear. No one would force Annie to retreat any farther. Richard saw everything. No one touches the folder, he said. Miles tried to keep his voice polite, but his irritation was now obvious. Sir, if she leaves with disputed company property, we may lose control of the situation. Annie looked at him, the hurt in her expression gradually giving way to suspicion. A few minutes ago you called it waste paper. Now it's company property? That is not what I said. That is exactly what you said. Miles clenched his teeth. Young lady, you should be careful with your tone. The man standing behind the woman with the cane immediately spoke up. There's nothing wrong with her tone. The way you've been speaking to people has been the problem all day. Another person added, she's been standing here longer than most of us. Miles looked across the waiting line, his expression darkening. If everyone cannot remain orderly, the food distribution will have to stop. The atmosphere inside the warehouse changed immediately. The murmuring ceased. Several people tightened their grip on their carts. A mother pulled her young child closer. An elderly man looked down at the food assistance card in his hand. They had already waited for hours. Some of them might have nothing to eat when they returned home. Miles knew that merely threatening to stop the distribution would force most of them into silence. Annie realized it too. She looked at the people behind her. The fear on their tired faces made her forget her own humiliation. Please don't stop distributing the food because of me, she said to Richard. They've been waiting all day. Miles seized the opportunity at once. Exactly. That's why she needs to step aside and let us continue working. Annie met Richard's eyes. I'll step aside, but I'm keeping my papers. Richard pointed toward an open space near the wall. We'll speak over there. Annie looked at the security officers surrounding him. Don't let them surround me. You're not under arrest. But the way he spoke made me feel as though I had done something wrong. Richard remained silent for a moment, then looked back at Miles. You will remain at this table and continue serving the people in line. Miles appeared relieved that he was not being removed from the area. Of course, sir. I'll make sure everything runs smoothly. And you will replace that bag of food. The smile disappeared from Miles's face. Sir? Richard pointed toward the thin grocery bag on the table. She asked for low-sodium food for her grandmother, who has diabetes. Find it for her. We only distribute standardized food packages. Then open the storage room. Miles hesitated. The items in there are reserved for photograph donations and scheduled partner events. Richard stared at him, seemingly unable to believe what he had just heard. There is better food inside this building, but you're keeping it locked away while the people outside are hungry? Miles glanced toward the cameras, searching for an explanation that would not damage him. The premium food boxes are allocated through a different process. To whom? The sponsorship and branding agreements are quite complicated. Richard's voice turned cold. Hunger isn't. Miles had no answer. At that moment, a woman in a dark navy suit crossed the warehouse. She wore no employee badge, but the people who recognized her immediately stepped aside. Evelyn Shaw stopped in front of Annie. Unlike Miles, she did not reach for the documents without permission. May I see the certificate? She asked. Annie looked at her cautiously. You'll give it back? As soon as I finish examining it. Only after hearing that promise did Annie reluctantly open the folder. She removed the certificate with both hands and gave it to Evelyn. Evelyn inspected the seal, the registration number, and the signature at the bottom of the document. When she recognized her own signature, her expression immediately became serious. This is genuine. The entire area seemed to hold its breath. Richard hurried closer. Did you prepare this transfer? Evelyn looked at him over the top of the document. I cannot discuss a client's legal affairs in front of a crowd. Your client is my father. My client is the person who retained me. Annie looked from Evelyn to Richard. Everyone around her seemed to understand what was happening. She alone remained standing there in her faded coat, unable to understand why a piece of paper once dismissed as trash had made the most powerful people in the room so tense. Can someone please tell me what this means? Evelyn immediately returned the certificate to her. It means that from this moment forward, you must not sign anything. Do not surrender this folder to anyone, and do not answer any more questions until you have independent legal counsel protecting your interests. Annie accepted the document, her eyes growing even more confused. Am I in trouble? No, Evelyn said. But many people may want you to believe that you are. Miles stepped forward. You're making this far more serious than it needs to be. Evelyn turned toward him. Are you the man who tried to take her documents? Miles adjusted his collar. I was simply processing an applicant for food assistance. No. Evelyn's gaze turned cold. You attempted to control a legal document you had no authority to touch. After publicly humiliating its owner, Miles pressed his lips together. Richard raised one hand and rubbed his forehead. The cold sweat had still not disappeared. Where is my father? An elderly but steady voice came from behind the waiting line. You could ask me yourself, Richard. You could ask me yourself, Richard. Harold Caldwell came through the crowd with one hand resting on a wooden cane. An aide walked beside him, but Harold set the pace. People recognized his face from the banners near the entrance, although his photograph there was decades younger. Richard turned toward him. Dad, why are you here? To attend the event carrying my family's name. You were supposed to be resting. I have rested long enough while other people made decisions in my name. Harold's attention shifted to Annie. His expression softened. Miss Brooks. Annie held the folder closer. Mr. Harold? That's right. She looked from him to Richard, then to the Caldwell Global logo behind the tables. You're his father? Harold stopped beside her. I am. Richard stepped between them. Did you give her those documents? I did. Why? Harold looked down at the dented can on the table. Before we discuss that, I'd like to know why this young woman was handed food you wouldn't put in your own kitchen. Miles came around the table, smiling again. Mr. Caldwell, welcome. We weren't expecting you. There's been a small misunderstanding with the inventory, but I'm handling it. Harold turned toward him. Who are you? Miles Grayson, sir, Director of Community Outreach. We've met at 2 board receptions. That explains why I don't remember you. Miles's smile tightened. Of course, you meet a great many people. I tend to remember the ones who treat others well. Miles glanced toward Richard. As I explained, the applicant caused a delay because her documents were disorganized. The woman with the cane spoke from behind Annie. That isn't what happened. Miles ignored her. Harold did not. Ma'am, what did happen? She asked for food her grandmother could eat. He mocked her clothes, threw the bag on the table, and told her to leave if she couldn't find her paperwork fast enough. A man farther back added. Then he pushed the file off the table. I did no such thing, Miles said. The folder slipped while she was handling it. Annie looked at him. You shoved the papers toward me. Miles raised a hand. I'm not going to debate an applicant in front of donors. Harold's eyes settled on him. You will not call her an applicant as though that makes her less worthy of an answer. Richard lowered his voice. Dad, this is not the place. This became the place when your employee tried to throw her out. Richard glanced at the reporter, who remained several yards away behind the communications director. We need privacy. Harold nodded toward Annie's folder. Privacy for whom? Evelyn stepped closer. Harold. Richard has seen the certificate. I confirmed the copy is genuine. It is not merely a copy, Harold said. The ownership transfer has been completed and entered into the corporate ledger. Richard stared at him. You transferred all 49%? Yes. To her? Harold's voice remained controlled. Her name is Annie Brooks. You met her 1 month ago. That was enough time to learn something about her character. And enough time to hand over nearly half the company? You have worked beside me for 30 years, Richard. Time does not always reveal character. Sometimes it only gives a person more opportunities to hide it. Richard's face hardened. You cannot make a decision this large without consulting the board. I consulted independent counsel. I followed the shareholder agreement. The board was notified through the required legal channels. I received no notice. You received what the law required, not what your pride demanded. Annie looked at Evelyn. Does this mean the paper is really mine? The shares are registered in your name, Evelyn said. The certificate confirms that registration. I don't know anything about shares. You can learn. I don't want to take anybody's company, Richard answered before Evelyn could. Then give the documents back and let our attorneys correct this. Harold struck the rubber tip of his cane once against the concrete. No, Richard turned on him. She just said she doesn't want it. She said she doesn't understand it. That is not the same thing. Annie stepped away from both men. Please stop talking as though I'm not here. Harold immediately faced her. You are right. I apologize. Richard said nothing. Annie looked at Harold. When you gave me the folder, you said it might help if things got bad. You didn't tell me it would bring people around me, take over the food line, and make everyone stare. I should have explained more. You should have explained everything. Yes. The direct answer eased some of her anger, though not enough to settle her hands. Why me? Harold glanced toward the people waiting for food, then back to Annie. Because I needed the shares placed with someone who understands that a company affects lives beyond its offices. I believed you would ask questions my family had stopped asking. You don't know me. I know you refused money when you needed it. I know you stayed until I had proper help. I know you returned to your own responsibilities, without asking who I was, or what I could give you. Annie shook her head. That doesn't make me qualified to run a corporation. You are not being asked to run it today. Richard gave a short, bitter laugh. She can stop a merger, demand audits, and nominate directors. Let's not pretend this is symbolic. Harold looked at him. I am not pretending. That authority is why I transferred the shares. Without telling me, because you would have tried to stop me. You're right. Miles edged closer to Richard. Sir, I can clear the warehouse and move everyone outside while this is resolved. Annie turned to him. No, Miles frowned. This no longer concerns you. It concerns everyone still waiting. She pointed toward the unopened cartons behind the tables. You said there was better food in storage. That inventory is allocated. To photographs, Annie asked. Miles looked toward Richard. The premium packages are reserved for partner events. Harold's mouth tightened. Open the storage area. Miles hesitated. I would need authorization. You have it. From the current CEO, Miles said carefully. Every face turned toward Richard. He looked at the line, the cameras near the entrance, and the certificate in Annie's folder. Then he nodded to Miles. Open it. Miles remained still. Richard's voice sharpened. Now. Miles signaled to two workers. They unlocked a set of metal doors behind the tables. Inside were boxes of oatmeal, canned vegetables, fresh produce, and low-sodium soup. A murmur moved through the line. Annie stared at the supplies that had been kept out of sight while people were handed damaged cans. Harold looked at Richard. Is this what community service means now? Richard did not answer. Annie stepped toward the table. Everyone who waited should receive the same quality food. No special boxes for cameras. No one loses a bag because this took too long. Miles said, we don't have enough staff to reorganize the distribution. The woman with the cane raised her hand. Some of us can help. Others offered as well. Annie looked at Richard. Can they finish serving everyone before this place closes? Richard studied her for several seconds. Yes. And nobody has to pose for a photograph? Yes. And I keep my folder? Richard's eyes moved to the certificate. Evelyn answered for him. You keep it. Annie nodded. Then I'll speak with you after the last person gets food. Harold's expression carried quiet approval. Richard looked less certain. For the first time that afternoon, Annie was no longer waiting for permission to be heard. She had made a decision, and the people with money, titles, and security badges were adjusting their plans around it. The final person left the warehouse carrying 2 grocery bags and a box of oatmeal. Volunteers began folding tables while the remaining workers returned the better food to the storage area. Annie stayed near the wall with her folder under one arm and a fresh bag packed for her grandmother at her feet. Miles had disappeared into an office after Richard ordered him to prepare a full inventory report. No one had seen him return. Richard checked his watch. We should go to headquarters. Legal can explain the transfer there. I'm not going anywhere until my grandmother knows where I am, Annie said. You can call her from the car. I'm taking the bus home. Harold looked toward the entrance, where several reporters still waited behind the glass doors. That may not be wise. I came here on the bus. You arrived before anyone knew your name, Evelyn said. That has changed. Annie glanced at the people holding up phones outside. I didn't ask for that. No, Evelyn replied. But we still have to deal with it. Richard stepped closer. A company car can take you home. After that, we meet privately and settle this. Annie frowned. Settle what? The ownership question. Miss Shaw said there is no question. Richard looked at Evelyn. There are always questions when 49% of a company changes hands without the CEO being informed. Harold adjusted his grip on his cane. The CEO was not a party to the transfer. I'm your son. That is a family fact, not a legal right. Annie picked up the grocery bag. You can explain everything to my grandmother. If she thinks I should meet you again, I will. Richard stared at her. You need permission from your grandmother? I need her advice. There's a difference, Harold said. Richard exhaled and signaled to his driver. The car stopped outside Annie's apartment building less than 40 minutes later. Richard had left for headquarters after insisting that Thomas verify the corporate ledger. Evelyn rode with Annie and Harold, while a second vehicle followed at a distance. Annie stepped onto the cracked sidewalk and looked up at the windows. A curtain on the second floor moved. By the time they reached the stairs, Ruth had already opened the apartment door. Her eyes went first to Annie, then to Harold's cane, Evelyn's briefcase, and the driver waiting near the curb. Annie, she said, why is the man from the hospital standing outside my home? He isn't from the hospital, Grandma. Harold removed his hat. Good evening, Mrs. Brooks. My name is Harold Caldwell. May we come in? Ruth studied him. You are the man she helped. Yes, ma'am. And the other woman? Evelyn Shaw, Evelyn said. I'm an attorney. Ruth looked at Annie again. Did somebody accuse you of something? No, at least I don't think so. That is not an answer that comforts me. Annie held up the grocery bag. Can we go inside? Ruth stepped aside. Harold waited until she invited him to sit before taking the chair nearest the small kitchen table. Evelyn sat across from him. Annie put away the food, while Ruth examined each item. Oatmeal, Ruth said. They finally found some sense. It was in the storage room. Ruth looked over her shoulder. What was it doing there? That's part of the problem. When the groceries were stored, Annie placed the folder on the table. She took out the certificate and slid it toward Ruth. Ruth read slowly, moving one finger beneath the lines. 49%? Yes, Evelyn said. Of what? Caldwell Global. Ruth looked at Harold. Your company? The company I founded. And you gave almost half of it to my granddaughter? I transferred the strategic shares I held. Ruth removed her glasses and cleaned them with the edge of her sweater. Then she read the certificate again. Annie, did you sign anything? No. Did you ask him for money? No. Did you know what these papers meant? I thought they might be worth a little. I took them to a pawn shop when we needed your medicine. The owner called them trash. Ruth's eyes closed for a moment. You never told me that. I didn't want you to worry. I worry when you hide trouble, not when you tell me about it. Harold leaned forward. Mrs. Brooks, I owe both of you an apology. I should have explained the transfer more clearly. You should have asked whether she wanted it. I believed giving her time before revealing the value would protect her from pressure. Instead, she carried it through the city in an old folder. Yes. Ruth returned the certificate to the table. Why, Annie? Harold answered without hesitation. Because she helped me when she believed I was an ordinary man. She refused payment. She stayed until she knew I was safe. My company needs someone who understands that another person's need is not an opportunity for publicity. That sounds noble, Ruth said. Noble things can still become burdens. I know. Do you? Harold accepted the question without protest. I am beginning to. Evelyn opened her briefcase. Mrs. Brooks, the transfer is legal. Annie is listed in the shareholder ledger. The certificate confirms that ownership. But the certificate itself is not the only proof. Can Richard Caldwell take it from her? No. Can Harold change his mind? Not by himself. Can Annie sell it? She can, but the agreement contains safeguards. No one can force her to make a quick sale. and she should not sign anything without independent advice. Ruth nodded toward Evelyn. Independent from whom? From Harold, Richard, and Caldwell Global. I prepared the transfer for Harold, so I cannot serve as Annie's permanent personal attorney. I can protect the documents tonight and help her find counsel who answers only to her. Annie sat beside Ruth. Do I have money now? Not in the way people will assume, Evelyn said. You hold shares with substantial value, but they are not cash in a checking account. There may be future distributions, but that requires proper review. Then why was Richard so scared? Harold looked at the certificate. Because those shares can stop the merger he is planning. They can require an independent audit. They also allow you to nominate representatives to the board. Annie stared at him. I can stop his company from doing something. You can stop our company from doing certain things, Harold said. The word made her uncomfortable, Ruth noticed. She does not have to decide anything tonight. No, Evelyn said. Tonight, she signs nothing. A phone vibrated on the table. Annie looked at the screen. The message came from a number she did not recognize. Take the money when they offer it. Girls like you do not survive families like theirs. Ruth read it over her shoulder. Harold's face tightened. May I see that? Annie locked the screen and kept the phone in her hand. No, but you may tell me how someone got my number before I even made it home. Evelyn held out her hand. Annie, don't delete the message. I wasn't going to. Take a screenshot, then send it to me. We'll preserve the number and the time. Ruth looked at Harold. Who knew she had those shares? My attorney, the transfer agent, and the corporate secretary. Then one of them talked. Or someone saw what happened at the warehouse, Evelyn said. There were phones everywhere. Annie sent her the screenshot. Before she could put the phone down, it rang again. This time the caller ID showed a local television station. She rejected the call. Another came from a different number. Then a text appeared from someone claiming to represent a national business program. Ruth pushed the phone face down. That thing stays off tonight. A knock sounded at the door. Everyone turned. Miss Brooks? A man called from the hallway. Channel 8 News. We'd like to ask Annie a few questions. Ruth stood. How did they get here so fast? Evelyn closed her briefcase. Someone gave them the address. Harold rose with care. My driver can take both of you somewhere private. No, Ruth said. We're not being driven out of our home because strangers want a picture. A second voice came through the door. Annie, did Harold Caldwell give you shares after you helped him? Were you aware of his identity? Annie moved toward the window. 2 news vans had stopped at the curb. A camera operator stood beside the front steps, while neighbors watched from their doors. Ruth drew the curtain. Harold took out his phone. I'll have security clear the entrance. No one is turning this building into a guarded property, Ruth said. People here have to go to work in the morning. Evelyn considered the narrow hallway and the growing noise outside. Mrs. Brooks, staying is your right, but Annie's name and address are public now. The message she received makes this more than a press problem. Ruth looked at Annie. What do you think? Annie hated that the answer was obvious. Every knock would disturb the neighbors. Every camera would follow Ruth to the pharmacy, the grocery store, or church. We should leave for tonight. Harold nodded. There's a guest house on my property. Separate entrance, private rooms, no reporters. Ruth pointed at him. One night. That does not give your family control over us. It does not. And no photographers. None. And your son does not walk in whenever he pleases. Harold almost smiled. That condition may benefit all of us. They left through the rear stairwell while Evelyn spoke with the reporters at the front. Annie carried the folder under her coat and kept one hand beneath Ruth's arm as they descended. By the time they reached Harold's property, Annie's face was already on television. The guest house living room had a couch, 2 armchairs, and a television mounted above a stone fireplace. Ruth switched it on only long enough to check the weather. Annie's photograph filled the screen. It was not her graduation picture. It was an image from the warehouse, taken while she crouched on the floor gathering papers. Her coat was wrinkled. Her folder lay open, and Miles stood over her. The headline read, Unknown Teen Claims Control of Caldwell Empire. The anchor spoke while another image appeared beside hers, this one showing Richard at a business conference. Questions are growing tonight after a young Atlanta woman appeared at a Caldwell Global charity event with documents indicating that she may control 49% of the company's strategic shares. May control, Ruth repeated. They had no trouble calling Richard the head of an empire. The report continued. Sources close to the company say the transfer was made by founder Harold Caldwell, following a recent personal encounter with Annie Brooks. It remains unclear whether Brooks understood the value of the documents or whether Caldwell was properly advised. Harold stared at the screen. I was properly advised. Evelyn entered from the adjoining room. The report isn't asking whether you had advice. It's suggesting you lacked judgment. The broadcast cut to a business commentator. A transfer of this scale to someone with no corporate experience could threaten employees, investors, and a pending merger. The board may have a duty to challenge it. Annie lowered herself onto the couch. They make it sound like I stole something. They are using questions to make accusations they cannot prove, Evelyn said. Another program showed a close view of Annie's shoes and called her the food line heiress. Ruth turned off the television. That's enough. Annie checked her phone despite Ruth's warning. Thousands of comments had appeared beneath the warehouse video. Some accused her of deceiving Harold. Others asked why a girl receiving food assistance should control part of a major company. A few comments said she should accept whatever money Richard offered and disappear. One post showed her apartment building. Annie closed the page. They know where Grandma lives. We'll arrange protection without disrupting the neighbors, Evelyn said. I don't want guards following her. Protection can be discreet. Ruth sat beside Annie. Look at me. Annie did. People who learned your name this afternoon do not know your life. Do not let them tell it back to you as though they were there. But everyone will believe them. Not everyone. Enough people will. Harold remained near the fireplace. This is my fault. Ruth turned toward him. Regret won't protect her. What will you do? I'll issue a statement confirming that the transfer was voluntary and legal. Evelyn shook her head. Not tonight. If you respond too quickly, Richard's advisors will say Annie is speaking through you. She needs independent representation first. Annie looked at her. Can't I speak for myself? You can. The question is whether you should speak before we know what the company intends to do. As if summoned by the conversation, Evelyn's phone rang. She listened for less than a minute, then ended the call. That was the corporate secretary. Richard has scheduled an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Harold's expression hardened. For what purpose? He wants the transfer reviewed and Annie's voting rights temporarily restricted. Can he do that? Annie asked. He can ask the board to try. That doesn't mean he'll succeed. Ruth folded her hands. Does Annie have to attend? No, but Richard has also requested a private meeting with her before the board convenes. I'm not meeting him alone, Annie said. You won't. The next morning, Annie entered Caldwell Global through a side entrance with Evelyn and Harold. The lobby rose several stories above them. Employees crossed the marble floor with badges clipped to tailored jackets. Their conversations slowed when Annie passed. At the security desk, a guard looked at Evelyn's credentials, then Harold's face. When Annie stepped forward, he held out his hand. Identification. She is with us, Harold said. I still need hers. Annie handed over her state ID. The guard examined it twice before printing a temporary badge. A few employees watched from near the elevators. Annie clipped the badge to her old coat. On the 32nd floor, a framed photograph showed Richard handing a box of fresh food to an older couple. The box held fruit, vegetables, whole grain bread, and oatmeal. Annie stopped. That isn't what they gave us. Harold looked at the photograph, then at her. No, it isn't. Richard's assistant opened the conference room door. Mr. Caldwell will see Annie now. Evelyn entered beside her. Richard stood at the far end of the table. A folder waited in front of an empty chair. He did not offer his hand. Sit down, Annie. I'm prepared to make you an offer. He opened the folder and turned the first page toward her. At the top, beneath the Caldwell Global letterhead, was a number containing more zeros than Annie had ever seen. $25 million. Annie stared at the number until the commas began to lose their meaning. 25 million? She asked. Richard sat across from her. Paid through a structured settlement after the transfer is approved. You would receive enough immediately to buy a home, cover medical care for your grandmother, and continue your education without debt. Evelyn did not touch the folder. What does she surrender? Richard looked at her. I'm speaking to Annie, and I'm making sure she understands the offer. Annie turned the first page. The document was thick, filled with paragraphs she could not follow. What do you want me to sign? A sale agreement. You transfer the strategic shares to a holding company controlled by Caldwell Global. All 49%? Yes. And then I have nothing to do with the company? You would have $25 million. You would never need to worry about this company again. Richard said the amount as though it answered every question. Annie thought of the unpaid rent notice on Ruth's kitchen table. She thought of prescription bottles that lasted longer because Ruth sometimes took less than the doctor ordered. $25 million could replace every broken appliance in their apartment, pay every bill, and leave enough for a life Annie had never allowed herself to imagine. Richard pushed a pen toward her. This situation is already becoming difficult. Reporters are outside your home. People are questioning my father's judgment. The board is preparing to challenge the transfer. You can avoid years of litigation by ending it today. Evelyn pulled the pen away. She will not sign during this meeting. That decision is hers. It will be hers after independent counsel reviews every page. Annie looked at Richard. Why is there a confidentiality section? To protect both sides. It says I can't discuss the warehouse. The agreement covers company matters. What happened there is a company matter. Richard leaned back. You witnessed an employee handling a crowded distribution poorly. Miles will be reviewed. He gave better food to the cameras and kept the cheaper bags for everyone else. You don't know how the inventory was assigned. Neither did you. Richard's expression hardened. I run a company with thousands of employees. I cannot personally inspect every carton of food, but you put your name on the banners. Evelyn glanced at Annie, but did not interrupt. Richard folded his hands. This is exactly why the offer is reasonable. You have been pulled into a situation you are not prepared to manage. Take the money and build a good life. You are young enough to start anywhere. You make it sound like you're helping me. I am. Then why do I have to promise never to ask what was in those storage rooms? Richard's patience weakened. Because no corporation pays $25 million and leaves itself open to public attacks from the seller. Annie lowered her eyes to the agreement again. A house, reliable transportation, medical care, college. No more counting coins before entering a grocery store. No more pretending she was not hungry because Ruth had eaten less. The offer frightened her because part of her wanted it. Can I take this with me? She asked. You may review it here. Evelyn closed the folder. She will receive a complete copy. Richard looked at her. This proposal expires tomorrow. Why? The merger timetable cannot be delayed. Annie raised her head. What happens if I don't sell? The board will review whether the transfer should stand. Miss Shaw said it was legal. Legal documents can still be challenged. Would you challenge it if your father had transferred the shares to another businessman? Richard paused. Annie understood the answer before he gave one. That is not comparable. Why not? A qualified investor would understand the responsibilities involved. I can learn. Not before the merger deadline. There it was. The urgency was not about protecting her. Richard needed her signature before she understood why he needed it. Annie stood. I'm taking the copy. You are walking away from $25 million. I'm walking out of a meeting. That isn't the same thing. Evelyn picked up the folder, and they left before Richard could stop them. Ruth was waiting in Harold's guest house when Annie returned. The television was off, and a pot of chicken soup sat on the stove. Annie placed the offer beside Ruth's bowl. They'll give us $25 million. Ruth did not reach for the document. For what? The shares. All of them? Yes. Do you want to sell? Annie sat across from her. I want you to get proper care. I want us to have a place where the ceiling doesn't leak. I want to stop checking the price of everything before I decide whether we need it. Those are good things. Then why do I feel like I'm doing something wrong? Because they did not offer you freedom. They offered you silence. Annie looked toward the window. $25 million is more money than we could spend. That does not tell you whether it is a fair price. I don't even know what fair means anymore. Ruth finally opened the folder. Then find out before you sell. Later that afternoon, Evelyn returned with an independent valuation prepared from recent corporate filings and the proposed merger documents. She placed one page in front of Annie. Annie read the estimate twice. This can't be right. It is a range, not a guaranteed sale price, Evelyn said. But $25 million is a small fraction of the value Richard may gain if you surrender your rights. How small? Less than 1/10, based on the current merger terms. Annie's embarrassment hardened into anger. He thought I wouldn't ask. He hoped the number would be large enough to stop you from asking. The next morning, Annie returned to Caldwell Global. Richard was leaving another meeting when she approached him in the hallway. "I have one question." He stopped. "Have you made a decision? If what I have is worth so little, why do you need my signature so badly?" Richard's face answered before his voice did. "The offer was based on your circumstances." "My circumstances? It would change your life, so you price the shares by how poor I am, not by what they're worth." "That is not what I said. It's what the number says." Richard glanced toward the employees passing nearby. "Lower your voice." "No, you wanted me to sign before I understood anything. Now I want to understand everything." "What does that mean?" Annie held the agreement out to him. "I'm not selling." Richard did not take the papers. Annie continued. "I want to see where the food comes from, how much the company pays for it, and why the people in that line receive damaged cans while your photographs showed fresh produce. That operation is not relevant to the share transfer. It's relevant to me. You cannot walk into a warehouse and start inspecting company records." Evelyn stepped beside Annie. As the holder of the strategic shares, she can request an inspection through the compliance office. Richard looked from Evelyn to Annie. Annie held his gaze. "I'm starting with the warehouse." The warehouse inspection was scheduled for 9 the next morning, but when Annie arrived with Evelyn and a compliance officer, the front gate was locked. A guard stepped out of the booth and checked a clipboard. "No visitors are listed." Evelyn held up the written authorization. "This inspection was approved yesterday." The guard read the first page, then looked toward Annie. "Mr. Grayson said all outside visits were postponed." "She is not an outside visitor," Evelyn said. "She is a strategic shareholder." The guard shifted his weight. "I'll need to call someone." Annie looked past the fence. Several loading bays stood open, and workers moved pallets into refrigerated trucks. Nothing appeared postponed. 5 minutes later, Miles came through the side door wearing a safety vest over his dress shirt. His smile did not reach his eyes. "Annie, I wish you had called before coming all this way." "She did," Evelyn said. "Your office confirmed the visit. There was a scheduling mistake. We're conducting a safety review today." Annie pointed toward the workers' loading boxes. "The warehouse is still operating. Employees have training. Visitors don't. I'm here to inspect the food program." Miles lowered his voice. "You made your point at the distribution center. Richard is already reviewing the incident. Walking through an active warehouse will not teach you how a national operation works." "Then explain it while we walk." "You need protective equipment." A woman approached carrying 3 orange vests and safety glasses. She appeared to be in her late 50s, with gray beginning to show at her temples. A plastic badge identified her as Dolores Vega, night shift supervisor. "I was told to bring these," she said. Miles looked irritated. "Who told you?" "Compliance." The officer beside Evelyn raised his hand. "I did." Dolores gave Annie a vest. "Keep inside the yellow lines. Forklifts have the right of way." "Thank you," Annie said. Miles turned toward the guard. "Open the gate." Inside, the air smelled of cardboard, cold metal, and canned food. Miles began speaking before they reached the first aisle. "We distribute through more than 40 community partners. Inventory changes daily. Some products are donated, some purchased, and some provided under short-term vendor agreements. A single dented can does not represent the program." Annie stopped beside a pallet marked Community Nutrition Premium. "Can I see inside?" Miles kept walking. "Those are scheduled for a donor event." Annie opened the top carton. It contained oatmeal, brown rice, low-sodium beans, canned vegetables, and fruit cups packed without added sugar. The box looked almost identical to the one Richard held in the framed photograph at headquarters. "Where were these yesterday?" Annie asked. "They were allocated. To people who needed them. To a partner event with specific nutritional requirements. My grandmother has specific nutritional requirements." Miles crossed his arms. "Your household was not enrolled in that partner program. Why does somebody need the right program to receive food that won't make them sicker? That is not how supply allocation works." Dolores looked down at her clipboard. Annie noticed. "How does it work?" Miles answered before Dolores could. "Through contracts, availability, and distribution schedules." Annie walked to the next aisle. Plain cartons were stacked from floor to shoulder height. A label read, "Standard Relief Bag." She opened one. Instant noodles, white bread, sweetened cereal, and soup with more than 900 milligrams of sodium per serving. This is what we received. It is shelf, stable and cost. Efficient. Cost efficient for whom? For the program. Evelyn looked at the printed lot number. What did Caldwell Global pay per bag? Miles's face tightened. Pricing is confidential. The shareholder inspection includes vendor contracts, the compliance officer said. Not without finance approval. It was approved. Miles looked at him. By whom? Evelyn submitted the request under the strategic share provisions. Legal cleared it this morning. For a moment, Miles said nothing. Then he forced another smile. Fine, we'll arrange a conference room review. There's no reason to delay operations by opening random cartons. Dolores spoke quietly. The invoices don't match the cartons. Miles turned toward her. Excuse me? She kept her eyes on the clipboard. The quantities received don't always match what's entered. That is a receiving issue, and it is being handled. It's been happening for months. Miles stepped closer. Dolores, this is not the time to discuss unfinished internal reports. Annie looked at her. What reports? Dolores hesitated. Miles answered. Routine count differences. Damaged goods, shipping losses, late deliveries. Every warehouse has them. How large are the differences? Annie asked. Small. Dolores finally raised her head. Sometimes half the order. Miles's expression changed. That is false. I counted the pallets. You supervise the night shift. You do not have access to final reconciliation. I have access to what arrives. The compliance officer took out a notebook. Can you show me the count sheets? Miles stepped between them. This conversation is over until counsel is present. Evelyn looked at him. Counsel is present. You represent Harold. Today I am observing Annie's lawful inspection. You may call company counsel if you wish. Miles removed his phone and walked several feet away. Dolores watched him, then motioned Annie toward a small desk near the loading area. She opened a drawer and took out a spiral notebook. Each page contained dates, truck numbers, pallet counts, and product codes written by hand. Our system changes after the shipments are entered, she said. I started keeping my own record. Why? Annie asked. Because I got tired of being told I counted wrong. Evelyn scanned one page. This invoice says 800 cases. Your record shows 326. That's what arrived. Who changed the electronic count? I don't know. By morning, the system shows the full amount. Annie looked toward Miles. He was speaking into his phone with his back turned. Why didn't you report it? Dolores pressed her lips together. I did. Twice. To Miles, to him and compliance. What happened? The first time, he said the vendor corrected it. The second time, he reminded me I have 3 years left before my pension is fully protected. Annie understood the warning even without hearing the exact words. He threatened your retirement. Dolores looked toward the workers nearby. He called it advice. Annie touched the edge of the notebook. May we copy this? Dolores did not answer immediately. If I give it to you and nothing happens, I lose my job. I can't promise nothing will happen, Annie said. But I won't pretend I didn't see it. Dolores studied her face. That is what everyone says before they go back upstairs. I don't have an upstairs office. You have 49% of the company. And yesterday I was standing in a food line. I know what one missed paycheck can do. Dolores looked at Evelyn, then at the compliance officer. Copy the pages, she said. The notebook stays with me. Miles ended his call and returned. The tour is finished. Corporate counsel wants everyone at headquarters. Annie closed the carton of soup. Not yet. Miles stared at her. You do not control warehouse operations. No, but I can ask why this label says premium produce when the box contains canned soup. He glanced at the carton she indicated. Packaging errors happen. Then why are there 6 pallets with the same error? The compliance officer began photographing the labels. Miles reached for the carton. Stop taking pictures. Evelyn stepped between them. Do not touch the evidence. It is company inventory. And Annie is a company owner. Miles looked at Annie, no longer bothering to smile. You have no idea what you're interfering with. Annie held his gaze. That's why I'm going to keep looking. Miles's warning followed Annie into the conference room at Caldwell Global, but the records waiting on the table gave her something stronger than fear. 3 auditors sat beside stacks of invoices, warehouse reports, vendor contracts, and printed payment records. Evelyn introduced them as an independent team authorized under Annie's shareholder rights. Richard stood near the windows with two members of the board. He had not invited Miles to sit. The lead auditor, Sarah Mitchell, opened a spreadsheet on the wall screen. We compared the warehouse count sheets with the invoices submitted by the charity division, she said. The numbers do not match. Richard crossed his arms. By how much? That depends on the month. In some cases, Caldwell Global paid for twice the amount received. In others, the difference was larger. Miles leaned forward. Damaged goods, split deliveries, and delayed shipments can create temporary discrepancies. Sarah changed the display. These are not temporary. The system shows 800 cases received on March 4th. Miss Vega's handwritten log shows 326. The following morning, someone changed the electronic entry to 800. Warehouse staff make corrections all the time, Miles said. Who approved this correction? Miles glanced at the screen. I would need to check. Sarah moved to the next record. The same user account approved 47 similar changes. Richard looked at Miles. Whose account? Sarah answered. A regional administrator assigned to the community outreach office. Miles shook his head. Several people have access. Not according to information technology, Sarah said. The login requires an individual security code. Annie sat beside Evelyn with a notebook open. She had written down every term she did not understand. Most of the page was filled, but the pattern itself was becoming clear. They paid for food that never arrived, she said. Sarah nodded. That is one possibility. Another is that the food arrived somewhere else. We have not completed the tracing process. What about the food that did arrive? The auditor displayed a purchase order for canned soup. Caldwell Global paid $14.80 per case through a vendor called Bright Path Distribution. Annie frowned. Is that expensive? The original seller charged Bright Path $3.10. Richard moved closer to the screen. You're saying the vendor increased the price almost 5 times? Yes. Miles spoke quickly. Bright Path provides transportation, storage, packaging, and delivery. You cannot compare the wholesale price to the completed service cost. Sarah opened another document. Transportation was billed separately. So was storage. Packaging was charged through a second company. Annie followed the lines across the page. They charged the company 3 times for moving the same food? In several transactions, yes. Richard looked at Miles. Who approved Bright Path? The vendor committee. You chaired that committee. I presented the recommendation. Finance and compliance signed off. Evelyn placed a corporate registration form on the table. Bright Path was created 7 months ago. Its registered agent shares an address with David Grayson. Miles's face tightened. David is a common name. Is he your brother-in-law? Evelyn asked. That has nothing to do with the quality of the service. It has everything to do with whether you disclosed a conflict of interest. I did not participate in his private business. Richard held out his hand. Did you disclose the relationship? Miles did not answer at once. Annie looked at him. You asked me to prove I needed food, but nobody asked you to prove you weren't making money from it? This is a corporate review, he said. Not an opportunity for you to make accusations. She asked a reasonable question, Sarah said. Miles turned toward Richard. We should stop this meeting until company counsel reviews the audit process. Annie's request is being used to search records far beyond the warehouse incident. Richard looked at the invoices. Continue. Miles stared at him. Richard, sit down. Miles remained standing for another moment, then returned to his chair. Sarah displayed a diagram showing several companies connected by payment arrows. Bright Path received more than $4 million from the charity division. It transferred part of that money to a consulting company called Meridian Civic Strategies. What did Meridian do? Annie asked. We have found no employees, office lease, or completed consulting reports. Then why was it paid? That is one of the questions we are investigating. Evelyn pointed to another line. Meridian transferred funds to an investment partnership. Richard read the name. Northgate Equity. Sarah nodded. One of Northgate's managing entities is registered to a former business partner of Miles Grayson. Miles stood again. This is speculation. Knowing someone who manages a fund does not mean I received money. We have not said you did, Sarah replied. We are showing the path of the payments. Harold entered with a folder under one arm. His aide remained outside. Richard looked at him. You should be resting. I've heard that advice enough this week. Harold sat beside Annie and looked at the payment diagram. When I started the company, an invoice told us who drove the truck, who loaded the boxes, and which store received them. Now it takes 6 corporations to explain a can of soup. Annie gave him her notebook. I'm trying to understand why the numbers keep changing. Harold took 3 wooden truck models from his folder and placed them on the table. One represented the original seller, one the middle company, and one the warehouse. If this truck sells the food for $3, he said, moving the first model, and this one charges nearly $15 before passing it to us, you ask what value was added between those 2 points. Storage and delivery, Annie said. Only if those services weren't charged somewhere else. She checked the invoices again. They were. Then the extra money did not feed anyone. Annie looked at the screen. $12 million had been announced as charity spending. The verified food received was worth less than $3 million. Richard turned to Sarah. How long will it take to confirm the full amount? Several weeks, unless we gain access to the deleted files. Miles looked up. Deleted? Sarah studied him. 3 warehouse computers were reset within an hour of Annie's inspection request. That could be routine maintenance. All 3 on the same morning? I don't manage the technology schedule. Richard faced him. Did you order those resets? No. Sarah closed one spreadsheet and opened an email log. We also found 3 earlier warnings about Bright Path. They were sent to Community Outreach, Compliance, and the CEO's office. Annie turned toward Richard. He read the dates without speaking. One message was marked reviewed by your executive office, Sarah said. Richard's expression changed. I don't remember seeing it. Harold looked at his son. Not remembering a warning does not mean no one warned you. Richard kept his eyes on the screen. I want the original emails. You'll have them by the end of the day, Sarah said. Miles reached for his phone beneath the table. Annie noticed. So will I, she said. He looked at her. She closed her notebook. This time, nobody changes the numbers before I read them. By the time Annie returned to Harold's guest house, the emails from the audit had not arrived. Something else had. Ruth stood in front of the television with the remote in her hand. Annie appeared on the screen beside a headline that read, Teen shareholder accused of targeting Caldwell family. Turn it up, Annie said. I don't think you should hear this. I need to know what they're saying. Ruth raised the volume. A reporter stood outside the hospital where Harold had been treated the month before. New video obtained this evening raises questions about Annie Brooks's account of her first meeting with Caldwell Global founder Harold Caldwell. The broadcast cut to a grainy recording. Annie recognized the hospital entrance. Her voice came through the speaker. I need money for my grandmother. The clip ended there. The reporter continued. Sources claim Brooks discussed financial hardship before Harold Caldwell transferred strategic shares estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Annie stepped closer to the screen. That isn't what happened. Ruth lowered the remote. What did you actually say? I told the nurse I couldn't stay much longer because I had to get home. Mr. Harold offered to pay for a car. I said I needed the money I had for Grandma's medicine, so I was taking the bus. The broadcast showed the same 6-second clip again. They cut everything around it, Annie said. Evelyn entered from the hallway with her phone against her ear. Do not respond online. They're lying. I know. Then why should I stay quiet? Because whoever released that video wants you angry enough to say something they can use. Annie pointed at the television. They already have something they can use. They made it. Evelyn ended the call and faced her. The footage came from a private security camera. Someone paid to obtain it. Can we prove that? Not yet. The report moved to a pawnshop owner standing outside his business. Annie recognized him before his name appeared. She came in with a bunch of papers, he told the reporter. She wanted money and acted like the documents were valuable. I told her I wasn't getting involved. Annie stared at the screen. He laughed at me. The owner continued. I had a bad feeling. Something about the whole thing didn't add up. Ruth switched off the television. He called them trash, Annie said. He didn't even read them. Evelyn sat across from her. My investigator checked his financial records. Yesterday, a consulting firm paid him $15,000. Which consulting firm? Meridian Civic Strategies. The same company from the audit? Yes. Ruth gripped the remote. Then put that on the news. We need records proving what the payment was for. If we accuse him before we have that, Miles will say it was a legitimate consulting fee. What would a pawnshop owner consult on? Annie asked. That is the question we'll make him answer under oath. Annie's phone began vibrating on the table. Messages filled the screen faster than she could read them. Liar, gold digger, take the money and leave that family alone. One message included a photograph of Ruth leaving their apartment building. Annie turned the phone face down. Ruth saw the picture. They followed me? A neighbor said a man sat in a car across the street this afternoon, Evelyn said. Security is checking the license plate. I don't want men watching my home. I know, Mrs. Brooks. But someone is already watching it. Ruth walked to the kitchen without answering. Annie followed her. Grandma? Ruth opened a cabinet, took out 2 bowls, then put one back. Mrs. Parker from church called, she said. What did she want? She asked whether you knew who Harold was before you helped him. Annie waited. I told her no. Did she believe you? Ruth placed both hands on the counter. She said she wanted to. The answer hurt more than the messages from strangers. Ruth had known Mrs. Parker for 26 years. They had prepared church meals together, attended funerals together, and taken turns driving each other to medical appointments. I'm sorry, Annie said. You did nothing wrong. But this is happening because of me. No. It is happening because somebody is afraid of what you found. Annie returned to the living room. Evelyn was reading a new message. What is it? Dolores didn't report for work tonight. Annie stopped. Did anyone call her? Her phone is off. Could Miles have fired her? The warehouse says she requested leave. Did she? We don't know. Annie picked up her coat. Evelyn stood. Where are you going? To find her. You don't know where she is. I know where she works. And Miles knows you were with her. Walking into that warehouse tonight would give him another headline and possibly interfere with the audit. So we do nothing? We verify before acting. Annie's frustration broke through. That's what everyone keeps telling me. Wait before speaking. Wait before going back. Wait before telling people they're lying. Meanwhile, Miles deletes files and pays strangers to change their stories. Evelyn's voice remained steady. He wants you to confuse movement with progress. At least movement feels like something. So does walking into traffic. Annie turned away. Evelyn softened her tone. Silence can be discipline, Annie. It must never become surrender. Tonight, discipline means preserving evidence and keeping Dolores safe. Annie looked at her. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we trace the payment, secure the original video, and find out who accessed the warehouse computers. A notification appeared on Evelyn's phone. She read it twice. What now? Annie asked. Dolores sent an email from a new account. The message contained no greeting, only one sentence. I kept copies before they erased everything. Attached was a photograph of a small USB drive resting beside the handwritten warehouse notebook. Annie leaned closer. Where is she? She didn't say. Another message arrived. Miles knows about the notebook. He told me my pension disappears if I speak. Ruth returned from the kitchen and read over Evelyn's shoulder. 3 years, Annie said. She told me she had 3 years left. Evelyn nodded. That is enough time for a threat to work. Annie looked at the television's dark screen, where her reflection replaced the false headline. Tell Dolores she won't face him alone. Evelyn began typing. Before she could send the reply, Annie's phone rang from an unlisted number. She answered without speaking. Miles's voice came through. You should have taken Richard's offer. Annie tightened her grip on the phone. Where is Dolores? He gave a quiet laugh. You still don't understand. This stopped being about food the moment you opened that folder. Annie pressed the phone closer to her ear. You called me. So tell me what you want. I want you to understand your position, Miles said. You are 18, surrounded by people who see those shares as an opportunity. Evelyn wants a case. Harold wants revenge on his son. Richard wants the merger. None of them care what happens to you when this is over. And you do? I'm offering advice. You threatened Dolores's pension. A pause followed. I don't know what she told you. She kept copies. Miles's voice lost its confidence for half a second. Copies of what? You tell me. Evelyn motioned for Annie to keep him talking while she activated the recording function on her own phone. Miles recovered. Warehouse records are company property. Removing them can be grounds for termination. Changing them can be grounds for something worse. You're repeating things you don't understand. Then explain the missing food. There is no missing food. Explain Bright Path. Vendor relationships are not your concern. They became my concern when you made money from food that never reached people. You cannot prove that. Annie glanced at Evelyn. Not yet, she said. Miles' breathing changed over the line. Take Richard's offer. $25 million is more than you will ever see again. Sign the agreement. Let the company correct the transfer and go back to your life. My life? Yes. The one where my grandmother stretches her medicine because your program spends $12 million on food worth less than 3? You think one audit makes you an expert? No. I think it makes you nervous. Miles ended the call. Evelyn saved the recording. He did not confess, but he confirmed that he knows about Dolores and the missing records. He also said Harold wants revenge. Men like Miles mix truth with lies because it makes the lie easier to carry. Annie looked toward the dark television. Does Harold want revenge? That is a question for Harold. The question for Richard is why his office received 3 warnings and did nothing. The following morning, Annie entered Caldwell Global, carrying printed copies of the emails Sarah had delivered overnight. Evelyn walked beside her, but Annie asked to speak first when they reached Richard's office. Richard stood behind his desk, reviewing a merger file. I have 10 minutes. You had 3 warnings. He looked at the papers in her hand. The auditors are still verifying those messages. They came from your own system. That does not mean I personally read them. Annie placed the first email on his desk. This one was sent 8 months ago. It says Bright Path charged the charity division for deliveries that never reached the warehouse. Richard glanced at it. My office receives hundreds of messages every day. The second one says the food quality could harm people with diabetes and high blood pressure. Compliance should have handled it. The third one says Miles had a family connection to the vendor. Richard closed the merger file. What do you want me to say? The truth. I don't remember all 3 emails. Do you remember any of them? Richard looked toward Evelyn. Is this an interview? No, Evelyn said. It is a shareholder asking the CEO about a possible failure of oversight. He returned his attention to Annie. I remember a summary about vendor complaints. Miles told us the program had grown too quickly, and the reporting system needed time to catch up. And you believed him. He had run successful events in 6 states. He ran successful photographs in 6 states. Richard's mouth tightened. You are reducing a national operation to one bad afternoon. I went to the warehouse and disrupted it. I saw cartons marked premium produce filled with canned soup. I saw records changed after the trucks arrived. I met a supervisor who was threatened because she counted what came through the door. You heard one employee's account. I also saw the invoices. Richard stood and walked toward the windows. Caldwell Global employs more than 18,000 people. One public accusation can affect contracts, retirement accounts, and families who have nothing to do with Miles. That's why you didn't investigate? That is why decisions require more than anger. I'm not angry because a number is wrong. I'm angry because people stood in line all day while somebody took money from the food meant for them. And if your investigation destroys the merger, the company loses access to new distribution markets. Warehouses close. Drivers lose routes. Employees lose insurance. Are you prepared to carry that too? Annie had not expected the question to reach her so quickly. She thought of Dolores and the 3 years between her and a protected pension. That doesn't make hiding it right. It makes the situation larger than you understand. Then help me understand why the merger matters more than finding out where the money went. Richard turned from the window. Because a chief executive cannot stop a billion-dollar transaction every time a department reports a problem. This wasn't every time. It was 3 times. He looked at the emails again. Annie lowered her voice. Did you see the first warning? Richard did not answer. She waited. Finally, he said, my assistant included it in a weekly risk report. And? Miles said the invoice had already been corrected. Did you check? No. Why? Because I had a company to run. Annie picked up the dented soup can she had carried in her bag and placed it beside his merger file. That company was running this too. Richard stared at the can. My father built Caldwell Global to move freight. he said. Then he started expecting it to solve every problem in every town we entered. He gave away routes, delayed expansion, and kept people on payroll long after their divisions stopped making money. You say that as if loyalty was his mistake. Loyalty without limits can bury a company, and profit without limits can bury everybody else. Richard's eyes narrowed. You sound like him. I barely know him. That may be why you still admire him. Annie studied Richard's face. You think he gave me the shares to punish you? He gave them to someone who could stop the merger he has opposed for 2 years. Then why not give them to Evelyn? Or another board member? Richard had no answer ready. Annie continued. Maybe he chose someone outside this building because everyone inside had learned how to look away. That is easy to say when you have never signed a payroll. It is also easy to say hunger is complicated when you have never opened an empty cabinet. Richard's phone rang. He ignored it. It rang again. His assistant entered without waiting to be invited. Her face had changed. Mr. Caldwell, it's your father. Richard reached for the phone. What happened? He became ill during a meeting at the foundation office. His aide called emergency services. They're taking him to the hospital for observation. Richard was already moving toward the door. Annie stepped aside. Before leaving, he looked at the 3 warnings on his desk, then at the can beside the merger file. For the first time, he did not tell her the investigation had to stop. Richard reached the hospital before Annie and Evelyn. By the time they arrived, he was standing near the nurse's station with his jacket folded over one arm and his phone pressed to his ear. No, he said. Do not release a statement until the doctor speaks with me. He ended the call and looked at Evelyn. They're keeping him overnight for observation. His heart rhythm changed during the meeting, but he is stable. Annie stopped a few feet away. Can I see him? He's resting. I asked if I could see him. Richard studied her, then glanced toward the closed door at the end of the hall. 5 minutes. Evelyn touched Annie's arm. Let the medical staff decide. A nurse came out and confirmed Harold could have 1 visitor at a time. Richard expected to enter first, but Harold had already asked for Annie. Richard's expression tightened. Of course he did. Annie entered without responding. Harold lay against raised pillows with monitoring leads attached beneath his hospital gown. His cane rested against the wall. He looked tired but alert. You're supposed to be resting, Annie said. I've heard that from everyone except the people trying to schedule meetings without me. She moved closer to the bed. Richard said you're stable. That means the doctors are not frightened enough to admit they're worried. Don't joke about it. I'm not joking. I'm complaining. Annie sat beside him. The auditors found the warnings sent to Richard's office. Harold's expression changed. Did he admit seeing them? 1 summary. And he did nothing. He says Miles told him the problem was corrected. Harold looked toward the window. Richard has always confused delegation with distance. He thinks a problem stops reaching him once he gives it to someone else. The merger could affect thousands of jobs. So could fraud. He said stopping it could close warehouses. That may be true. Annie had expected Harold to dismiss the warning. Then what am I supposed to do? Ask whether they are protecting the workers or using them to protect themselves. Before Annie could answer, Evelyn entered. I'm sorry, Harold. We have a problem. Harold pushed himself higher against the pillows. Another one? The board secretary sent notice of an emergency meeting, 48 hours from now. For what purpose? They want to suspend Annie's voting protections while they challenge the transfer. Annie stood. Can they do that? They can vote to attempt it, Evelyn said. Company counsel is arguing that Harold may not have understood the consequences of the transfer, and that you lack the experience to exercise the rights safely. Harold's voice hardened. They intend to call me incompetent while I am still in the hospital. They also want authority to complete the merger before the review is finished. Richard approved this? The notice came from his office. Annie looked toward the hallway. He said nothing about a meeting. He may have authorized it before we arrived. Harold reached for the call button, but Evelyn stopped him. Do not turn this into a medical argument with your nurses. I'm leaving. No, you are not. Harold gave her a look that might have ended most conversations. Evelyn did not move. You hired me because I tell you the truth when everyone else is protecting your comfort. If you leave against medical advice, the board will use that decision as evidence that your judgment is impaired. Harold released the button. What does Annie need? He asked. Evelyn opened her briefcase. She must attend the meeting. We need the original transfer records, confirmation from the notary, and the physician's statement showing you were competent. when the documents were signed. We also need evidence that the audit serves the company's interests. We have the invoices, Annie said. We have signs of fraud. We still need the files Dolores copied. Annie checked her phone. No new messages. Has anyone found her? Her sister says Dolores left home with a suitcase yesterday. She would not say where she went. She's scared. She has reason to be. Richard appeared in the doorway. The visit is over. Harold looked at him. You called the meeting. The board demanded action. You lead the board. I lead a company that is losing contracts by the hour. Because Annie found fraud? Because the public thinks our founder transferred control to someone he met on a roadside. I did not transfer control. I transferred the shares I had the legal right to transfer. Richard stepped inside. You gave veto authority to someone who had never seen a balance sheet. And you gave charity money to someone who treated hunger as a business opportunity. That accusation has not been proven. It would have been investigated months ago if you had done your job. Richard's face tightened. You think every problem is proof that I failed your values. I think you stopped asking whether your values had failed other people. The nurse appeared behind him. Mr. Caldwell needs rest. Richard looked at Annie. My offer still stands. Harold turned toward her. What offer? $25 million for the shares, Annie said. Harold's eyes moved to his son. You tried to buy them before she had independent advice. I tried to prevent this. You tried to profit from what she did not know. Richard's voice dropped. Take the offer, Annie. Let him recover. Let the company move forward. You can care for your grandmother and never worry about money again. Annie looked at Harold, then at the monitor beside his bed. For the first time, the offer did not feel like an insult. It felt like an exit. That evening, she returned to the guest house and placed the agreement on the kitchen table. Ruth read her face before looking at the papers. You want to sign? If I don't, the board attacks Harold's judgment. The merger may fail. Workers could lose jobs. Dolores could lose everything. People keep getting hurt because I opened that folder. People were already being hurt, but I didn't know their names. That did not make the harm smaller. Annie sat down. I'm not ready for this. Probably not. Annie looked up, surprised. Ruth opened the pantry and took out the grocery bag from the first distribution. She removed the dented soup can and placed it beside Richard's agreement. When I worked in the school cafeteria, a manager cut portions to save money. I knew the meals were too small. I said nothing because I needed my paycheck and my insurance. Annie rested her hands on the table. I kept my job, Ruth continued. But every afternoon, I watched people leave hungry. Fear protected my position and damaged my respect for myself. You had no power. I had a voice. I decided it was too expensive to use. Ruth pushed the can toward her. They are not afraid because you suddenly have money. They are afraid because someone who stood in that line can now enter their meeting and ask where the food went. Annie looked at the signature line. What if I fail? Then fail while telling the truth. Annie picked up the agreement and tore it through the center. The sound was small, but the decision was not. She placed both halves beside the dented can. I'm going to that meeting. Evelyn entered from the hallway with her phone in her hand. Then we need to find Dolores before tomorrow night. Annie stood and reached for her coat. This time, she did not ask whether she was ready. Evelyn made 3 calls before they left the guest house. The first went to Dolores' sister, who refused to give an address. The second went to an attorney who handled whistleblower cases. The third went to Sarah Mitchell, who agreed to meet them as soon as the files were secured. Annie waited until Evelyn finished. Her sister knows where she is. She does. Then why won't she tell us? Because Dolores believes anyone connected to Caldwell Global could be following the calls. I'm connected to Caldwell Global. That is part of the problem. Ruth handed Annie a container of soup and 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil. You may be searching for hours. Take this. Grandma, I'm not hungry. You said that yesterday. Annie put the food in her bag. Evelyn's phone rang again. She listened, asked 2 questions, then wrote an address on the back of an envelope. Dolores will meet us, she said. Her sister gave us one condition. No company security. Agreed. She also wants proof that an independent attorney will protect her. Evelyn held up her phone. He's meeting us there. The address led them to a roadside motel outside Atlanta. The sign had several missing letters, and the parking lot held only a few cars. Evelyn parked near the office, but did not get out immediately. Before we go inside, "You need to understand something," she said. "Dolores may decide not to give us the files. We cannot pressure her." Miles pressured her. "That does not give us permission to do the same." Annie looked at the second-floor walkway. "What if the board meeting happens before she decides? Then we use what we have. It may not be enough. Justice does not become justice when we force a frightened person to risk everything for us." Annie nodded. "I'll let her decide." A man in his 60s waited near the stairwell with a leather case. He introduced himself as Martin Bell, an employment attorney. Evelyn had worked with him on 2 previous whistleblower cases. "Dolores is in room 27, he said. "She agreed to speak with you, not to turn anything over." They climbed the stairs together. Martin knocked twice, paused, then once more. The door opened several inches. Dolores looked at Annie before checking the parking lot behind them. "You came without company security?" "Yes," Annie said. Dolores let them inside. A small suitcase rested near the bed. The warehouse notebook lay on the desk beside a motel coffee cup. Dolores had placed a chair against the inside of the door, though she moved it aside before sitting. "I did not steal anything," she said. "The records were created during my shifts. I copied them because people kept changing the numbers." Martin sat near the desk. "Copying records can still violate company policy. But policy is not the only issue. If the files show fraud, retaliation against you may violate state and federal law. May, I won't lie to you. Protection does not always stop retaliation before it happens. Sometimes it gives us a way to fight afterward." Dolores looked at Annie. "And what happens while we fight?" "My health insurance does not wait for a court decision." Annie sat across from her. "I can request temporary protection for anyone cooperating with the audit." "Request?" "Yes. You cannot guarantee it." "No." Dolores's mouth tightened. "At least you're honest. I know what one missed paycheck can do. I also know that what you give us may cost more than I understand. You own 49% of the company. That doesn't mean I control every person in it. Richard does." And he ignored the warnings. Dolores looked down at her hands. "I gave that company 18 years. When my husband died, the warehouse workers brought food to my house for 2 weeks. Harold sent a card with a handwritten note. I kept it in my locker. Loyalty is not the same as protecting someone who is doing wrong," Annie said. "It feels the same when the company pays your mortgage." Annie did not argue. Dolores continued. "I reported the count differences because I thought Miles would correct them. The first time, he thanked me. The second time, he asked how long I had left before retirement. After that, my schedule changed. My overtime disappeared. Then one of the office workers told me the electronic logs were being replaced." "So you copied them," Evelyn said. "I copied what I could." She opened the drawer beneath the desk and removed a small USB drive. "I have the receiving logs, invoices, internal emails, and recordings from 2 meetings. Miles told us to change expiration dates on the inventory reports. He said the food was still safe and the public would never know." "Did he mention Bright Path?" Sarah asked through a video call Evelyn had placed on the desk. Dolores nodded. "He said Bright Path was the only vendor able to meet the numbers promised in the charity reports." "Even though the numbers were false?" Annie asked. "He said donors cared about totals, not pallets." Dolores handed the USB to Martin, not Annie. "I want a legal copy made before the auditors touch it." "That is the correct approach," Martin said. He sealed the drive inside an evidence envelope and wrote the time across the flap. Evelyn and Dolores signed beneath it. "Is there anything connecting Miles to the companies receiving the money?" Evelyn asked. Dolores opened the notebook and removed a folded printout. "This came through the warehouse printer by mistake. It lists payments from Meridian Civic Strategies to Northgate Equity. Miles's private email address is copied on the approval." Evelyn read the page. "This is more direct than anything the audit found. There's more on the drive." Annie leaned forward. "Did Richard know?" Dolores hesitated. "His office knew. I cannot prove he opened every warning." "That isn't what I asked." Dolores looked at her. "A compliance officer spoke to him after a board dinner. I was there because the warehouse had donated supplies for the event. Richard said, 'Let Miles clean it up after the merger.'" Annie felt the words settle into place. Richard had not simply missed an email. He had chosen a deadline over an investigation. Martin stood with the sealed drive. I'll make protected copies and contact the appropriate investigators. Until then, Dolores stays away from company property. What about the board meeting? Annie asked. If the records are authenticated tonight, Evelyn can present them tomorrow. Dolores looked at Annie. Miles will say I'm a bitter employee. Then you won't stand there alone. You cannot promise what the board will believe. No, but I can promise they will hear your evidence before they vote. Dolores studied her for several seconds. You really refuse $25 million? Yes. Why? Annie thought of the dented can beside Richard's agreement. Because they were not paying me for the shares. They were paying me not to ask where the food went. Dolores reached for her coat. Then I'm coming to the meeting. Martin objected. You do not need to appear in person. I hid in this room because I thought keeping my pension would protect the life I built. But if I let Miles erase those records, I'll spend the next 3 years working for a lie. Annie stood beside her. You should come because you choose to, not because we need you. Dolores picked up the notebook. That's why I'm coming. When Annie returned to the guest house, Evelyn placed a clean copy of the evidence summary on the kitchen table. Ruth had ironed Annie's mother's white shirt and laid it beside her old coat. I thought you might need this tomorrow, Ruth said. Evelyn looked at the coat. We can arrange a suit. Annie touched the repaired cuff. No. They need to see the same person Miles thought he could send away. She opened the evidence summary and began reading. By morning, she would enter a room filled with people who believed experience gave them the right to dismiss her. This time, she would not arrive carrying papers she did not understand. Annie entered Caldwell Global through the main doors with Evelyn on one side and Dolores on the other. Ruth had stayed with Harold at the hospital, but she had buttoned Annie's mother's white shirt herself before Annie left and reminded her not to apologize for taking up space. Reporters filled the sidewalk. Some shouted questions about the shares. Others asked whether Annie planned to destroy the merger. She kept walking. Inside the lobby, the same security guard who had examined her identification twice during her first visit stood behind the desk. Good morning, Miss Brooks, he said. Annie returned the greeting and continued toward the elevators. On the 32nd floor, Richard waited outside the boardroom. His tie was slightly crooked, and there were dark marks beneath his eyes. You brought Dolores, he said. Dolores decided to come, Annie replied. Richard looked at the notebook in her hand. Company counsel will challenge anything taken from the warehouse. Martin Bell stepped from the elevator behind them. They may challenge it through the proper process. The original files are already secured. Richard's attention moved to Evelyn. You sent them to investigators. I preserved evidence, she said. What happens next depends on what the evidence proves. The boardroom doors opened. A long table faced a wall of windows overlooking Atlanta. Annie recognized several people from her first meeting. Others had joined by video. An empty chair near the end of the table carried Harold's nameplate. Richard took the seat at the head. Annie sat across from him. The company's lead attorney began with a prepared statement. He described the transfer as unusual, disruptive, and potentially harmful to the company. He questioned whether Harold had understood the effect of placing strategic voting rights in Annie's hands. Then he turned toward her. Miss Brooks, have you ever served on a corporate board? No. Have you studied finance? Not formally. Have you reviewed a merger of this size before? No. Then on what basis do you believe you are qualified to interfere with one? Annie opened the folder in front of her. I'm not here to pretend I know everything you know. A board member named Charles Whitman leaned toward his microphone. That is exactly the concern. Good intentions are not the same as competence. You're right, Annie said. Good intentions did not stop anyone from paying almost 5 times the cost of food that never reached the warehouse. Charles looked toward Richard. This meeting is supposed to address the voting rights. The audit is why you want to suspend them, Annie said. So the two issues are connected. The attorney objected, but Evelyn placed the strategic share agreement on the table. Annie has the right to explain why the investigation serves Caldwell Global's interests before the board votes. Richard gave a small nod. Annie placed 2 food bags in front of her. One was the thin bag from the charity line. The other had been prepared from the premium boxes stored behind the distribution tables. This bag was handed to people after the cameras moved away, she said, touching the first one. This one was used in photographs. She removed a dented can of soup. The people waiting were told to be grateful. They were not told that the company had better food in the same building. Miles sat 3 chairs from Richard. Inventory is separated by program requirements. We have explained that several times. Annie opened the audit summary. Then explain why Caldwell Global reported paying for 100,000 food packages while warehouse records show fewer than 33,000. Miles looked toward the attorney. Those records are incomplete. Sarah Mitchell joined through the video screen. The comparison includes invoices, receiving logs, shipping records, and inventory entries. We have verified the gap. Annie displayed the next document. Bright Path Distribution charged the company $14.80 per case for soup it purchased for $3.10. Transportation and storage were billed separately. A board member adjusted her glasses. Who approved Bright Path? Sarah answered. The vendor committee chaired by Mr. Grayson. Miles folded his arms. The committee approved the contract, not one person. Evelyn placed a corporate filing beside Annie's report. Bright Path's registered manager is Miles Grayson's brother-in-law. The relationship was not disclosed. Richard turned toward Miles. You told me the connection was too distant to matter. It was disclosed to finance. Finance says it was not. Miles looked around the table. This is an attempt to blame one department for a complex distribution system. Annie continued before the discussion could shift. Bright Path sent part of the money to Meridian Civic Strategies. Meridian has no listed employees and no completed reports. It then transferred funds to Northgate Equity. She placed the payment record on the screen. Miles' private email address appears on the approval. Miles leaned forward. That proves nothing. People copy me on financial documents every day. Dolores opened her notebook. I recorded the pallets that arrived during my shifts, she said. The electronic numbers were changed after I entered them. The company attorney looked at her. Did you remove confidential information? I copied records after Mr. Grayson told us to change expiration dates and replace receiving totals. Miles turned toward her. That never happened. Martin placed the sealed evidence receipt on the table. Recordings of those instructions have been preserved and authenticated for review. Richard stared at Miles. Annie moved to the final set of documents. 3 warnings about Bright Path reached the CEO's office. One was included in Richard's risk report. Another warned that the food could harm people with diabetes and high blood pressure. Richard spoke before she finished. I have already acknowledged receiving one summary. And you decided to wait until after the merger. His eyes moved toward her. I relied on Miles' assurance that the issue had been corrected. Annie placed the dented can beside his nameplate. A company does not become safe because everyone agrees to hide the fire. Charles Whitman shook his head. You are using emotional language to influence a legal decision. I'm using the food your company distributed. She looked around the table. I may not understand every number in this room yet, but I understand hunger. I understand what it means when someone makes money from another person's shame. Miles pushed back his chair and stood. I will not sit here while an inexperienced girl accuses me of theft based on records she cannot interpret. He gathered his phone and documents. Before he reached the door, the elevator opened outside the boardroom. 2 federal investigators stepped out with a representative from the company's security division. One of them entered and asked, Miles Grayson? Miles stopped. He looked at Richard, waiting for him to intervene. Richard remained seated. For the first time, he offered Miles no protection. The lead investigator stepped into the boardroom and held up his credentials. Mr. Grayson, we have a warrant to seize your electronic devices and company records connected to Bright Path Distribution, Meridian Civic Strategies, and Northgate Equity. Miles looked at Richard. This is a misunderstanding. Tell them the company is conducting an internal review. Richard did not move. Answer their questions. You know how these contracts work. You approved the program. I approved a charitable program. I did not approve false invoices. Miles gave a bitter laugh. You approved every report that made you look generous. Now you want to pretend you never asked how the numbers became so impressive? Several board members turned toward Richard. The investigator reached for Miles's phone. Please, place the device on the table. Miles pulled it away. I need to contact counsel. You may contact counsel after the device is secured. The company's security representative moved to the door. Miles looked around the table as though someone might object, but no one spoke. Dolores opened her notebook. Tell them about the expiration dates. Miles faced her. You altered company records and removed confidential files. Do not stand there pretending you are innocent. I recorded what arrived, Dolores said. You changed what the system said arrived. You were angry about your schedule. You removed my overtime after I reported you. You were an unreliable supervisor. I worked 18 years without a disciplinary notice. Martin Bell placed a personnel summary on the table. That statement is supported by her employment record. The investigator took Miles's phone and asked him to step outside. Before leaving, Miles pointed toward Richard. He knew enough. Do not let him turn me into the only man responsible. Richard's face tightened, but he offered no answer. The doors closed behind Miles and the investigators. For several seconds, the board members looked at one another, uncertain whether to continue. Charles Whitman cleared his throat. The criminal investigation is separate from the matter before this board. We still need to determine whether Miss Brooks should retain strategic voting authority. Evelyn leaned forward. The authority is already hers. You are deciding whether to challenge a lawful transfer because she used that authority to uncover fraud. The company attorney adjusted the papers in front of him. The board must also consider Harold Caldwell's capacity when the transfer occurred. A screen at the end of the room turned on. Harold appeared from his hospital room wearing a buttoned shirt beneath a dark sweater. Ruth sat nearby but outside the camera's main view. A physician and a notary were seated behind him. Harold looked directly into the camera. I understand the board has questions about my mind. Richard lowered his eyes. The physician introduced herself and confirmed that Harold was alert, oriented, and able to make financial and legal decisions. She also stated that his medical records from the date of the transfer showed no condition that would have impaired his judgment. The notary held up copies of the transfer documents. I witnessed Mr. Caldwell review and sign these papers. Independent counsel explained each provision before he signed. Charles leaned toward the screen. Mr. Caldwell, did Annie Brooks ask you for company shares? No. Did she know their estimated value? Not when the transfer was completed. Why would you give that authority to someone without corporate experience? Harold folded his hands. Because corporate experience had not protected this company from corruption. It had taught too many people how to explain corruption without stopping it. Charles looked displeased. That does not answer the question of qualification. It does. Annie knows she has more to learn. That already gives her an advantage over people who believe their titles make them incapable of failure. Richard finally spoke. You chose her to stop the merger. I chose her because the shares were created to protect the company from decisions driven only by profit. The merger gave her an early reason to use them. You could have told me. I spent 2 years telling you what I believed the merger would do. You heard opposition and called it disloyalty. You gave an outsider the power to block everything I built. Harold's expression remained steady. You panicked when you first saw the certificate because you hoped it was false. Then you panicked more when you learned it was true. Richard looked away from the screen. Harold continued. For the first time, your power rested with someone you would not have noticed in a food line. The boardroom settled into a strained silence. Charles called for a vote on the motion to suspend Annie's strategic rights. Before ballots were distributed, Evelyn raised her hand. The bylaws require evidence of fraud, incapacity, or breach of duty. You have presented none. The company attorney replied, inexperience may create unacceptable risk. Then half this board would have been suspended before its first meeting, Evelyn said. The motion went forward. 6 members voted against suspension. 3 supported it. 2 abstained. The motion failed. Annie released the edge of her folder. She had not realized how tightly she was holding it. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, then opened the merger agreement in front of him. We still have a choice, he said. The merger can protect jobs, expand distribution, and stabilize the company after this investigation. Approve it today, and I will support an independent charity board. We will replace every dollar taken and increase the food budget. Annie looked at him. And you remain chairman? Yes. The merger continues before the audit is complete. Yes. And the company announces reforms before it knows how many people were involved. We cannot freeze every operation while investigators work. Richard pushed the signature page toward her. You can help repair the charity program without damaging the rest of the company. You and your grandmother will receive financial protection. You can attend school, hire advisors, and take time to learn. Annie did not reach for the pen. You keep offering me a safer life whenever you need me to stop asking questions. I am offering a practical solution. You offered 25 million when you thought I did not know the value of the shares. Now you're offering reform because the evidence reached this room. Richard lowered his voice. Do not confuse punishment with justice. I'm not trying to punish you. Stopping the merger will cost people money. Completing it now could bury evidence and reward the same leadership that ignored 3 warnings. She turned toward the board. I am exercising the strategic veto. Richard's hand remained on the agreement. Annie continued. The merger is suspended until the forensic audit and federal review are complete. Miles Grayson is removed from all company authority. Employees who cooperate with investigators will receive legal and employment protection. The charity fund will be repaid from recovered money and company reserves. Its contracts, costs, and vendors will be published. She looked at Dolores. Workers and community representatives will sit on the new oversight committee. Then she faced Richard again. You will step aside as chairman, while the board reviews your failure to act on the warnings. You keep your shares. You receive due process, but you do not keep control simply because losing it makes you uncomfortable. Richard stared at her for a long moment. You came here asking for 1 bag of food. Annie placed the dented can in the center of the table. And you built an entire public image around people who needed it. Evelyn reviewed the vote requirements. With Annie's strategic authority and a majority of independent directors, each measure passed. When the final vote ended, no one celebrated. Dolores closed her notebook. Richard remained in his chair. Harold watched from the hospital screen. Evelyn gathered the signed resolutions. Justice did not arrive because the system became kind, she said. It arrived because enough people refused to remain silent. Annie looked at the city beyond the windows. Winning a vote would not refill an empty cupboard or repair the trust the company had broken. The certificate had given her power. What she did after the meeting would decide whether she used it any differently from the people who came before her. 1 year later, the same warehouse on Metropolitan Parkway no longer looked like a place designed for photographs. The Caldwell Global banners were gone. In their place, a plain sign near the entrance read, Community Food Market, choose what your household needs. There were chairs near the check-in tables, water dispensers along the wall, and volunteers trained to ask about allergies, medical restrictions, and transportation needs. Fresh produce, filled, open bins. Whole grain bread sat beside rice, beans, low-sodium soup, and oatmeal. No one was required to pose for a camera. Annie entered through the front doors wearing the same coat she had worn the day Miles Grayson tried to send her away. Ruth had repaired the cuff again that morning. You can afford another coat, Ruth had told her. I have another coat. 3, from what I saw in that closet. This one reminds me to pay attention. Ruth had accepted that answer, though she still insisted Annie wear the white shirt beneath it. Dolores stood near the inventory station, showing a new supervisor how to compare the delivery records with the actual pallets. Never approve what you haven't counted, she said. And never let anyone tell you a missing box is only a number. She noticed Annie and closed the tablet in her hand. You're early. So are you. I've been early for 19 years. Dolores had not lost her pension. The board had approved full protection for employees who cooperated with the investigation, and her overtime had been restored. She had also accepted a position on the Independent Food Program Committee. The federal case against Miles was still moving through court, but he had been charged with fraud, obstruction, witness intimidation, and misuse of charitable funds. More than $6 million had been recovered from accounts connected to Bright Path, Meridian Civic Strategies, and Northgate Equity. The pawnshop owner had admitted that a consultant working for Miles paid him to change his account of Annie's visit. His public apology lasted less than 2 minutes. Ruth had watched it once and turned off the television. An apology made after the truth catches you is still an apology, Ruth had said. But it is not the same as character. Annie had written that sentence in the notebook she carried to every board meeting. Evelyn approached from the registration area with 2 cups of coffee. One for you, she said. One for me. Harold has been told not to have any. Will that stop him? No, Ruth may. Harold entered a few minutes later with his cane in one hand and a paper cup hidden poorly behind his coat. Ruth walked beside him. Give it to me, she said. It's decaffeinated. It is not. You have no evidence. I asked the woman who sold it to you. Harold surrendered the cup. Annie smiled. You founded a transportation company, but you still can't move coffee past my grandmother. I made the mistake of underestimating Mrs. Brooks once. I am learning. His health had improved, though he attended fewer meetings. He spent 2 afternoons each week teaching Annie the history of Caldwell Global from the old records he kept at home. He did not teach her what to decide. He taught her where earlier decisions had led. Annie had enrolled in courses on business law and public policy at an Atlanta university. She still needed Evelyn to explain some corporate reports, but she no longer apologized when she asked for an explanation twice. She retained all 49% of the strategic shares. Part of her dividend income paid for Ruth's medical care and a small house near their old neighborhood. Another portion funded independent legal assistance for workers reporting fraud. The rest remained under professional management until Annie completed her education. She had refused every request to place her name on the food program. The people receiving help do not need to thank me, she had told the committee. They need a system that works whether I'm standing here or not. Richard arrived without an assistant or a camera crew. He was no longer chairman. The board had appointed an interim leader while investigators reviewed his failure to act on the warnings. Richard remained a shareholder and served in a limited advisory role under strict oversight. His public apology had been direct. He admitted that he saw a warning, accepted Miles's explanation, and delayed action because he feared damage to the merger. He did not call it a misunderstanding. The community had not forgiven him simply because he apologized. Annie had not asked them to. Richard stopped near the soup display and read the nutrition labels. He picked up one can, then another. Less sodium, Annie said. I noticed. A year ago, you wouldn't have. A year ago, I would have asked someone else to notice for me. That was the problem. Yes. The word came without an excuse. Richard looked toward the entrance, where people were choosing food instead of receiving identical bags. The quarterly cost is higher. The waste is lower. The old program reached more locations. The old report said it did. He nodded. Fair correction. A woman in a worn sweater approached the registration table carrying a thick envelope. Her hands tightened around it when an employee asked for her name. I have documents, she said. Rent notices, medical bills, and proof that my hours were cut. I don't know whether I brought the right ones. The employee stepped around the table rather than making her speak across it. You don't have to prove you deserve to eat, she said. Just tell us what your household needs, and we'll check the eligibility forms together. The woman's shoulders eased. She explained that she needed food with less salt and items that did not require much preparation. Annie remained where she was. A year earlier, Miles had used a crowded line to make her feel small. Now no one behind the woman complained about waiting. Chairs were available, and another employee opened a second station before the line could grow. Harold came to stand beside Annie. Do you ever regret turning down the $25 million? Annie watched Ruth question a volunteer about the sugar content in canned fruit, while Dolores corrected a delivery count nearby. No, you did not even pause. I already spent enough time thinking about that offer. Harold looked around the warehouse. You could have taken the money and still helped people. Maybe, but they weren't paying me for the shares. They were paying me to stop asking questions. Richard heard her from several feet away. He did not object. Annie walked to the loading area, where an older woman was struggling to carry 2 grocery bags. Annie took one. My car is near the side entrance, the woman said. I'll walk with you. You work here? Sometimes. They crossed the warehouse together. Near the exit, Annie passed the table where her folder had fallen. The old folding table had been replaced, but she could still remember the dented can rolling across its surface and Richard reading her name on the certificate. The certificate itself was now secured in Evelyn's office. Annie carried no legal documents that afternoon. She carried oatmeal, vegetables, and low-sodium soup for someone who needed help getting them to a car. Above the exit was a sentence Ruth had approved after rejecting 6 versions written by the Public Relations Department. No one should have to trade dignity for help. Harold read it each time he visited. Richard did too. Annie opened the door for the woman beside her. She had entered the warehouse a year earlier hoping to leave with 1 bag of food. She left that day with a reason to stop lowering her eyes, and she returned knowing that power meant little unless it helped someone else stand upright. This story reminds us that poverty does not erase dignity, intelligence, or worth. People should never be judged by their clothes, their address, or the line they are standing in. Real justice begins when someone is willing to question a system that profits from silence and humiliation. Annie's journey also shows that power is not measured by how much we own, but by how we use it to protect others. Kindness without respect is not true kindness, and leadership without responsibility is only another form of selfishness. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.